Today, I come with a word for someone who has been stuck between staying and leaving, between comfort and calling, between fear and faith. I came to tell you, God said it's time to exit. Now, when God says it's time to exit, He's not asking for your opinion, nor is He waiting for your comfort to align with His command. His timing is divine. It's perfect. It transcends your plans, your logic, and your emotions. When God speaks, His words are not suggestions or options. They're divine instructions, woven into the fabric of His perfect timing. Often we make plans, we set goals, and we map out our futures, thinking we have control over the seasons of our lives. But the truth is, no matter how carefully we plan, God's timing always overrides human planning. His timetable isn't bound by our calendars, our comfort, or our capacity to understand. Think about it. How many times have you planned something down to the last detail only to have it disrupted in ways you couldn't predict? It's in those moments that we realize God's timing is not about convenience. It's about purpose. His view stretches far beyond the limits of what we can see. Where we see detours, He sees divine direction. Where we see delays, He sees preparation. When God says it's time to exit, He's not asking whether you feel ready. He's not concerned with whether the timing aligns with your plans. He's calling you based on His knowledge of what's ahead, not your understanding of where you are. That's why divine timing often feels inconvenient. It interrupts our comfort zones and challenges our sense of control. But here's the truth. God doesn't operate on your clock. He moves according to His eternal agenda. And His plan is always perfect, even when it disrupts yours. Look at Noah. God told him to build an ark when there wasn't a drop of rain in sight. No storm clouds, no floods. Just a divine instruction that seemed out of sync with the natural world. But Noah obeyed, trusting that God's timing was rooted in what was coming, not what was visible. And when the rains finally came, Noah and his family were ready, not because they followed their own plans, but because they aligned with God's. The challenge for us is letting go of the need to control the process. We often pray for God's will, but expect it to fit neatly into our timelines. But faith isn't just trusting God for the blessing, it's trusting His timing for the blessing. It's believing that when He says it's time to exit, even if you don't feel ready, even if the resources aren't lined up, even if the path ahead looks unclear, His word is enough. Divine timing will often require you to exit before you see the next door open. It demands obedience over understanding. Because God isn't bound by the right moment as we see it. He creates the right moment. And when He speaks, the timing is always perfect, even if it feels premature to you. So the next time God says move, oh, don't hesitate, because your plan says stay. Trust that His timing transcends your understanding. And where He leads, provision and purpose will follow. When God calls you to exit, it's easy to see it as an ending. It feels like a chapter is closing, a door is shutting, and something familiar is being taken away. But in God's kingdom, exits are never about endings. They are about transitions. God doesn't call you out just to leave you wandering. He calls you out to lead you into something greater. The exit is not the conclusion of your story, simply the turning of a page. We often fear exits because we associate them with loss. Leaving a job, walking away from a relationship, moving out of a city, or stepping out of a role can feel like a death of sorts, a loss of identity, security, or purpose. But here's the truth. God never calls you to exit without preparing a transition. In his divine plan, every exit is a setup for the next stage of your destiny. Think about the Israelites. When God delivered them out of Egypt, it wasn't just an escape from slavery, it was a transition toward the promised land. But notice this, between Egypt and Canaan was the wilderness. That in-between space was uncomfortable, filled with uncertainty, but it was part of the process. The exit wasn't the end. It was the bridge to something better. That's where many of us struggle, the in-between. We exit one place but haven't fully entered the next, and it feels like we're stuck. But transitions are where God does his deepest work. It's in that space that he refines you, teaches you, and prepares you for what's next. If the Israelites had gone straight from Egypt to the promised land, they wouldn't have been ready. The wilderness was necessary to strip away their slave mentality and teach them to trust God fully. The same applies to you. When God says it's time to exit, he's not cutting your purpose short. He's moving you closer to it. But you have to recognize that the exit is a process, not an instant shift. It's a journey, and in that journey you face moments of doubt, fear, and discomfort. That's normal. But don't mistake the discomfort of transition for the absence of God. He's there, guiding you every step of the way. Exits also challenge your identity. You may have been known by your role, your title, or your environment, and leaving that behind can make you feel lost. But God often uses exits to redefine who you are. Moses was a prince in Egypt, but after his exit, he became a shepherd, and it was in that hidden place that God prepared him to become a deliverer. His exit led to a transformation. You have to understand that what feels like an end is often the beginning of something far greater. The job you lost, the relationship that ended, the opportunity that slipped away, these are not the final chapters. They are transitions leading you closer to your destiny. But the key is to embrace the process. Don't rush through it. Don't try to skip the wilderness. Trust that God is using the transition to prepare you, shape you, and position you for. Purpose is the driving force behind every season of your life. Nothing God allows is random or without intention. Every season you walk through, whether filled with joy, struggle, growth, or stillness, exists because there's a purpose attached to it. Purpose is what gives seasons their meaning and direction. Without understanding purpose, it's easy to misinterpret the season you're in. You might see a delay where God sees preparation, or view isolation as punishment when it's really positioning. In God's divine order, purpose always precedes the season. He doesn't create a season and then try to fit your life into it. No, he designs your purpose first and then aligns your seasons to develop, refine, and position you for that purpose. This is why it's so important to discern not just where you are, but why you are there. Every season serves the bigger picture of your destiny. Think of Joseph. His purpose was to become a ruler who would save nations, but his journey didn't start in a palace. It started in a pit, followed by slavery and then prison. Each of those seasons had a specific purpose. The pit stripped him of pride, slavery taught him discipline, and prison prepared him for leadership. None of those seasons made sense on their own, but when viewed through the lens of purpose, they were necessary steps toward his destiny. Without those seasons, Joseph wouldn't have been ready for the palace. The danger comes when we try to hold on to a season longer than its purpose requires. When the purpose of a season has been fulfilled, God calls you to exit it. But many times we get comfortable. We want to stay in the season of abundance. Or we resist leaving a place that once served us well, even when God says it's time to move on. But holding on to a season beyond its purpose can stunt your growth and delay your destiny. Ecclesiastes tells us, to everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven. This means that seasons are temporary, but purpose is eternal. Seasons will change, relationships will shift, doors will open and close, opportunities will come and go, but your purpose remains constant. It's the anchor that guides you through the ebb and flow of life. Sometimes God will allow you to go through difficult seasons, not to break you, but to build you. Seasons of obscurity may feel like punishment, but they're often seasons of preparation. David was anointed king, but spent years tending sheep and running from Saul. That season of waiting wasn't wasted. It was essential for developing his character and reliance on God. Purpose demanded that season, even though it didn't align with the promise immediately. And here's the key: you must trust God's timing in shifting your seasons. You can't rush out of a season just because it's uncomfortable, nor should you resist leaving when God says it's time to go. Purpose determines when it's time to stay, when it's time to grow, and when it's time to exit. And when you align yourself with that divine flow, you'll find peace, even in the most uncertain transition. So when God says it's time to exit, it's not a random decision. It's because the purpose for that season has been fulfilled. It's time to move forward into what's next, knowing that every step you take is purpose-driven, and every season you enter is a part of God's greater plan for your life. When God calls you to exit a place, a relationship, a job, or even a mindset, his expectation isn't that you fully understand every reason behind it. What he requires is obedience. Exits require obedience, not understanding. This is where many people struggle, because we are conditioned to want answers before we act. We want clarity before commitment, explanations before execution. But in the kingdom of God, it doesn't work that way. God often gives a command without revealing the full picture, because he's not testing your understanding. He's testing your trust. Throughout Scripture, God calls people to move without giving them all the details. Think of Abraham. God said, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. There was no map, no 5-year plan, no details, just a command to go. Abraham's obedience opened the door for him to become the father of many nations. Had he waited for understanding, he would have delayed his destiny. The challenge with exits is that they often don't make sense in the moment. You might be leaving something that's comfortable, successful, or familiar. Or worse, God may call you to exit without showing you what's next. It's in those moments that your faith is truly tested. Obedience means trusting that God knows what's ahead, even when you don't. It means moving forward, not because you see the entire path, but because you trust the one who does. Obedience also requires surrendering control. We like to be in charge of our steps, our plans, and our timing. But when God calls you to exit, it disrupts that sense of control. It forces you to let go of your agenda and align with his. And that's uncomfortable. It feels risky. But obedience is about believing that God's plan is better than yours, even when you can't see how. Consider the story of Peter stepping out of the boat. Jesus told him to come, and Peter obeyed, walking on water. It wasn't logical, it defied understanding, but in that moment, Peter's obedience allowed him to experience the miraculous. Yes, he began to sink when he focused on the waves, but the point is, he walked on water because he obeyed before he understood. This principle applies to your life too. There are places God is calling you out of that won't make sense right now. You might be asked to leave a secure job, end a relationship, move to a new city, or shift your focus, and your mind will scream for answers. But God says, trust me, obey me, because What's on the other side of your obedience is greater than anything you can comprehend right now. And let's be clear, obedience isn't about ease. It often comes with discomfort, uncertainty, and even criticism from others who don't understand your decision. People might question why you're walking away from something that looks good on the outside. But remember, they don't hear what God spoke to you in the secret place. Your obedience is not for their understanding. It's between you and God. Exits also have a way of revealing the depth of your trust. It's easy to obey when the path is clear, but true faith is displayed when you move even in the dark. When you walk away from something without knowing what's next, you're declaring, God, I trust your voice more than I trust my vision. Ultimately, obedience is the key that unlocks the next level of your destiny. Understanding may come later when you look back and see how God orchestrated everything perfectly, but the breakthrough, the blessing, and the fulfillment of your purpose require obedience first. So when God says it's time to exit, don't hesitate, don't analyze, and don't wait for perfect clarity. Step out in obedience, knowing that his plan is greater than your understanding, and your willingness to move will position you for what he has already prepared. One of the greatest barriers to stepping into God's purpose is the tendency to cling to what's familiar. We often hold tightly to people, places, and patterns simply because they feel safe, even when God is calling us to something greater. But the truth is, clinging to the familiar delays destiny. It keeps you stuck in cycles that God is trying to break, all because you're more attached to comfort than calling. The familiar seductive, it offers predictability and a sense of control, even when it's not ideal, even when it no longer serves your growth. The pull of what's known can be stronger than the push toward the unknown. That's why people stay in jobs they hate, relationships that drain them, or mindsets that limit them. There's something about the familiar that convinces us, at least I know what to expect here. But God didn't create you for stagnation. He created you for movement, for progress, for purpose. And purpose will always challenge the comfort zones you build around yourself. When God says it's time to exit, it's often because you've outgrown the place you're in. What once was a blessing can become a burden when you refuse to move on. The provision that sustained you in one season may dry up in the next. Not as a punishment, but as a sign that it's time to step into something new. Look at the Israelites. After being freed from Egypt, they found themselves in the wilderness. And what did they do? They longed to go back. They said it was better for us in Egypt. Imagine that. Wanting to return to slavery because it felt more familiar than the uncertainty of freedom. This is what clinging to the familiar does. It distorts your perspective and makes you desire what God already delivered you from. And it's not just about places, it's about mindsets too. Some people have exited situations physically, but are still bound mentally. You can leave Egypt, but if Egypt is still in your mind, you're not truly free. Clinging to old ways of thinking, fear, doubt, insecurity will keep you from stepping into the fullness of what God has for you. The danger of staying in the familiar is that it can cause you to miss divine opportunities. God could be opening a new door, but you're too busy staring at the old one, afraid to let go. Destiny requires you to release what's in your hand so you can receive what's in God's. But as long as you're holding on to what was, your hands aren't open for what's next. Think about Lot's wife. When God called Lot and his family to leave Sodom, the command was clear: don't look back. But Lot's wife did. She turned around, looking back at what God had called her out of, and in that moment, she became a pillar of salt. Why? Because she was still attached to where God had already moved on from. Her longing for the familiar cost her her future. And that's the warning for us. What you refuse to release can become the very thing that hinders your progress. Sometimes God's greatest blessings are waiting on the other side of your willingness to let go. But you have to trust that what God has ahead is better than what you're leaving behind. It takes courage to release the familiar, especially when the next step isn't fully clear. But destiny doesn't wait for your comfort. It moves according to God's timing. And the longer you cling to what's familiar, the longer you delay stepping into what God has ordained for you. So if God is saying it's time to exit, don't hold on to what's easy just because it's known. Let go. Trust Him and step forward. Your destiny is waiting, but it requires open hands and a willing heart. When God calls you to exit a place, a season, or a relationship, it becomes more than just a shift in your environment. It becomes a test of your faith. Exits have a unique way of revealing how much you truly trust God, not just in what He says, but in how He leads. It's easy to say you have faith when everything is stable, predictable, and going according to plan. But when God disrupts your comfort and tells you to move without revealing the full picture, that's when your faith is truly tested. Exits strip away the illusions of control we often cling to. They force you to step into spaces where the ground beneath you feels uncertain and the future looks blurry. And that's where faith comes in. Faith is not needed when everything makes sense. It's needed when nothing does. When God says it's time to exit and the next step isn't clear, your natural mind will look for reasons, signs, and guarantees. But faith doesn't operate on explanations. It operates on trust. Think about Abraham. God told him to leave his country, his people, and everything familiar to go to a land He would show him. There were no directions, no assurances, just a call to obey. Abraham's exit became the ultimate test of his faith. He had to believe that even without seeing the destination, God was leading him somewhere purposeful, and because of that faith, Abraham stepped into the destiny God had prepared for him. The same principle applies to us. Exits test whether we trust God more than we trust our own understanding. They reveal if we're willing to walk by faith and not by sight. And that's not easy. It's one thing to have faith for blessings and breakthroughs, but it's another to have faith in the middle of a transition where the old has ended but the new hasn't fully begun. Exits also test the endurance of your faith. It's one thing to step out initially, but what happens when the journey takes longer than expected? When the Israelites left Egypt, they had faith to exit. But when the wilderness dragged on, their faith began to waver. They questioned God, complained, and even considered going back. Exits will expose whether your faith is rooted in outcomes or in God Himself. Can you still trust Him when the road is longer, harder, and more uncertain than you thought? Exits test your faith in God's timing as well. Sometimes God will call you to exit before you feel ready, or He'll tell you to wait when you're eager to move. Both situations require faith, not just in the promise, but in the process. It's trusting that God sees what you can't and that His timing is always perfect, even when it doesn't align with your plans. One of the hardest parts about exits is the silence that often follows. You obey, you step out, and then nothing. It feels like God has gone quiet and doubt starts to creep in. But that silence is part of the test. It's in those moments that God is watching to see if you keep walking, even when you don't hear his voice. Faith isn't just about hearing. It's about trusting that the last word God spoke is still guiding you, even when he seems silent. Exits also test your faith in God's provision. Leaving behind something secure, whether it's a job, a home, or a relationship, can trigger fear about how you'll be sustained. But faith believes that if God called you to exit, he's already made provision for what's next. Just like he provided manna in the wilderness for the Israelites, he will provide what you need in your season of transition. Ultimately, exits are not about loss. They're about positioning. But to step into the new, your faith has to be stretched. It has to move beyond comfort, beyond logic, and beyond sight. When God calls you to exit, it's because he's preparing you for more. But to receive it, you have to pass the test of faith. You have to trust that the one who called you out will also lead you in, and that the exit is not the end. It's the doorway to the destiny he's been preparing for you all along. When God calls you to exit a place, it's not just about changing your location. It's about transforming your mindset. One of the biggest obstacles to fully stepping into your destiny is not the physical place you're leaving, but the mentalities you carry with you. This is what happened with the Israelites. God delivered them out of Egypt, but Egypt was still in their minds. They had left the land of bondage, but the bondage hadn't left them. Leaving Egypt physically was easy compared to leaving Egypt mentally. Egypt represents more than a place. It symbolizes limiting beliefs, toxic patterns, and enslaved mindsets that keep you bound even when you're free. It's the voice that tells you you're not enough, or you'll never make it without what you had. It's the fear that clings to the familiar, even when the familiar was harmful. And unless those mentalities are addressed, you can find yourself physically out of a situation, but still emotionally and spiritually trapped. The Israelites constantly longed to go back to Egypt whenever they faced challenges. They would say, we had food there, we knew what to expect. It didn't matter that they had been enslaved. The comfort of the known was more appealing than the uncertainty of freedom. That's what Egypt mentalities do. They make you romanticize the very things God rescued you from. You start questioning the exit, wondering if you made the wrong decision. All because the new path feels uncomfortable. But here's the truth. God can't bring you into the promised land if you're still thinking like a slave. You can't walk in purpose with a mindset that's still tethered to past pain, fear, or limitations. Leaving Egypt mentalities means letting go of the scarcity mindset that says there's never enough. It means breaking free from cycles of self-doubt, fear of failure, and feelings of unworthiness. It's about realizing that freedom isn't just a physical change. It's a mental, emotional, and spiritual shift. One of the hardest Egypt mentalities to break is the victim mindset. The Israelites saw themselves as grasshoppers compared to the giants in the promised land. They didn't believe they were worthy of what God had promised them. How often do we do the same? God opens doors, presents opportunities, but we disqualify ourselves in our minds. We carry the weight of past failures and believe we're not equipped for the future God is calling us into. Leaving Egypt mentalities also means letting go of dependency on what once sustained you. In Egypt, the Israelites were given food, even if it was under oppression. In the wilderness, God provided manna, but eventually he expected them to trust him for provision in the promised land. There comes a point where God wants you to stop relying on systems, people, or routines that once fed you and start trusting him directly. That shift requires a new mindset, one that operates from faith. Not fear, Another Egypt mentality is the belief that struggle defines you. After years in bondage, the Israelites' identity was shaped by oppression. Many of us carry the weight of past struggles as if they are who we are. But leaving Egypt means understanding that your past may explain you, but it doesn't define you. You are who God says you are, free, chosen, and destined for greatness. But leaving these mentalities isn't automatic. It takes intentional work. It requires renewing your mind daily, aligning your thoughts with God's truth, and rejecting the lies that try to pull you back into old patterns. It means recognizing when fear is speaking louder than faith and choosing to move forward anyway. The promised land is waiting, but you can't enter it carrying Egypt in your heart. God didn't just call you out to free you from a place. He called you out to free you from yourself, from every thought, belief, and fear that contradicts his plan for your life. Leaving Egypt mentalities is the key to walking fully in the freedom God has already given you. When God calls you to exit a place, a season, or a relationship, it's never random. His exits are always strategic, carefully orchestrated to position you for something greater. We often see an exit as a disruption or an ending, but from God's perspective, it's a calculated move within his divine plan. Nothing God does is accidental. Every exit he orchestrates is tied to purpose, timing, and destiny. God sees the entire picture while we only see fragments. What feels sudden or confusing to us has been part of his plan all along. When God told Noah to build the ark, it seemed unnecessary at the time. There was no sign of rain, no immediate threat, but God knew what was coming. That exit from normal life into the ark wasn't just about survival. It was about preserving a future. God's strategy always extends beyond the moment. He exits you from situations not just to protect you, but to prepare you for what's next. His exits are also about positioning. Think about Joseph. Being thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and imprisoned seemed like a series of unfortunate events, but every exit from one place to another was part of a divine strategy. God was positioning Joseph for leadership in Egypt, a place where he would save an entire nation during famine. Without the painful exits, Joseph would have never reached the palace. Sometimes what looks like a setback is actually a strategic setup. God's strategic exits also serve to sever ties that can hinder your purpose. There are people, places, and mindsets that can't go where God is taking you. When he calls you to exit, it's often to break connections that would weigh you down in the next season. Abraham had to leave his family and his homeland to step into God's promise. It wasn't about rejection, it was about redirection. God needed Abraham to be fully aligned with his vision, free from influences that could dilute his faith. Timing is another key element of God's strategic exits. He moves you at the right moment to ensure that you arrive where you need to be, exactly when you need to be there. The Israelites left Egypt at a divinely appointed time. It wasn't early or late, it was strategic. Even the path they took was intentional. God didn't lead them through the shortest route because he knew they weren't ready to face certain battles. Instead, he led them through the wilderness, a longer but necessary journey to prepare them for the promised land. God's exits are also designed to stretch your faith. They're strategic in building trust and dependence on him. When he called Peter to step out of the boat and walk on water, it wasn't just about performing a miracle. It was about elevating Peter's faith. The exit from the safety of the boat forced Peter to rely solely on Jesus, pushing him beyond the limits of his own understanding. Sometimes God's strategic exits are about protection, even when it doesn't feel that way. He may pull you out of a situation right before it collapses, or end a relationship before it turns toxic. In the moment, it may feel painful or confusing, but later you realize that God was shielding you from something you couldn't see. His strategy includes both what he reveals and what he withholds. What makes God's strategic exits challenging is that they often require movement without full clarity. He gives just enough instruction to move forward, but leaves out the details that require faith. This is intentional. God's strategy isn't just about the destination, it's about who you become along the journey. The exit is as much about the internal transformation as it is about the external shift. Every exit God orchestrates serves a greater purpose. It may feel uncomfortable and it may come without all the answers, but you can trust that it's part of a divine plan that's working for your good. His exits are not about loss. They're about alignment, preparation, and promotion. When God says, it's time to exit, it's because he's already prepared the next place for you. And every step you take is moving you closer to the destiny he strategically designed. When God calls you to exit, it's often because he's preparing to elevate you. Exits in the kingdom are rarely about loss. They're about positioning. God never calls you out of something without the intention of bringing you into something greater. But the path to elevation often starts with an exit, a necessary departure from the place, mindset, or relationship that's limiting your growth. Exiting for elevation means trusting that what God has ahead is far greater than what you're leaving behind. Even when the exit feels uncomfortable or unclear. Elevation requires separation. There are places you can't reach if you stay where you are. When God called Abraham to be the father of many nations, the first thing he told him was, leave your country, your people, and your father's household to a land I will show you. That exit wasn't about punishment or isolation. It was about positioning Abraham for a promise that required space away from familiar influences. Elevation often demands that you leave the crowd so God can work on you in private. It's in the places of separation where God molds, refines, and prepares you for the next level. Exits for elevation also come with pruning. Jesus said, every branch that bears fruit, he prunes so that it will bear more fruit. Pruning is an exit in disguise. It's the cutting away of what's no longer necessary for where you're going. It can look like losing relationships, stepping away from certain opportunities, or releasing old habits. It's painful in the moment, but it's purposeful. Without the pruning, the elevation would be limited. God removes what hinders so you can grow stronger and bear more. There's also a shift in responsibility that comes with exiting for elevation. The higher God takes you, the greater the weight of the calling. That's why exits often come with tests. God uses the exit season to build your character, stretch your faith, and ensure that you're ready for what's next. Joseph's exit from the pit to Potiphar's house, and later from the prison to the palace, wasn't random. Each exit prepared him for the responsibility of leading a nation. Without the trials, he wouldn't have been equipped for the throne. Exiting for elevation also requires a shift in perspective. You can't enter a higher level thinking the same way you did in the last season. God often uses exits to renew your mind, break old patterns, and instill new vision. The Israelites had to leave Egypt, not just physically, but mentally. God was taking them from slavery to sonship, but they couldn't enter the promised land carrying a slave mentality. Elevation demands that you see yourself differently through the lens of purpose and identity in God. The challenge with exits for elevation is that they often come before the promise is visible. God calls you to step out when the next level hasn't fully materialized. It's a test of faith, trusting that the exit is leading to elevation even when you can't see it yet. Peter experienced this when Jesus called him out of the boat to walk on water. The exit from the safety of the boat led to a moment of elevation, a supernatural experience that stretched his faith and revealed a new dimension of God's power. One of the most significant signs that your exit is for elevation is the presence of resistance. The enemy doesn't fight what doesn't threaten him. When God is positioning you for higher ground, expect opposition. But understand that the warfare is often confirmation that elevation is near. God uses the struggle to strengthen you, ensuring that when you reach the next level, you have the endurance to sustain it. Ultimately, exiting for elevation is about trust. It's about believing that God's plans are bigger than your current reality, and that the discomfort of leaving is temporary, but the reward of obedience is eternal. Every step away from what's familiar brings you closer to what God has destined for you. The exit is not the end. It's the beginning of a higher calling, a deeper purpose, and a greater impact. When God calls you to exit for elevation, it's because he sees the promise ahead, even if you can't yet. All he needs is your yes to take you there. When God calls you to exit, he doesn't intend for you to do it hesitantly or in fear. He calls you to exit boldly, with confidence in his plan, and to walk purposefully into what he has prepared for you. Boldness in exiting isn't about having all the answers or seeing the full picture. It's about trusting the one who called you to move. It's about recognizing that if God said it's time to leave, then there's something greater ahead, even if the path isn't clear yet. Exiting boldly means refusing to let fear dictate your steps. Fear will always try to convince you to stay where it's safe, where it's familiar, even if that place no longer serves your growth or your purpose. But faith demands movement. Think about the Israelites standing at the edge of the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army closing in behind them. They had exited Egypt, but now they face an impossible barrier. It was Moses' boldness, his willingness to trust God completely, that caused him to stretch out his hand over the sea, leading the people through the parted waters. That kind of bold exit requires focusing more on God's power than on the obstacles in front of you. Exiting boldly also means silencing the voices of doubt, both internal and external. There will always be people who question your decision, who tell you to stay where you are because it's safer, more predictable. But when God calls you out, you can't let the opinions of others drown out his voice. Abraham had to leave everything familiar without a clear destination, simply because God said so. It took boldness to step into the unknown, but that boldness positioned him to walk into God's promise. But exiting boldly isn't enough. You also have to walk purposefully. That means understanding that your exit has a reason, a direction, and a divine intention behind it. Walking purposefully is about moving forward with the mindset that every step is leading you closer to your destiny. It's not wandering aimlessly or second-guessing every decision. It's walking with the confidence that God is guiding each move. Purposeful walking requires alignment with God's timing and direction. It's about staying sensitive to his leading and not rushing ahead or lagging behind. The Israelites had a cloud by day and fire by night guiding them through the wilderness, symbolizing God's presence leading their steps. That same guidance is available to you when you exit with boldness and walk in purpose. It ensures you don't just leave something behind, but that you also arrive exactly where God intends. Walking purposefully also means embracing the process, even when it's challenging. The journey after the exit isn't always smooth or quick. Sometimes it involves wilderness seasons, times of testing, refining, and preparation. But purpose gives you the strength to keep moving forward, knowing that every trial is shaping you for what's ahead. David was anointed king long before he actually sat on the throne, but he walked through years of preparation, battles, and personal challenges. His purpose gave him the endurance to keep moving toward the promise. Another key aspect of walking purposefully is being intentional about your growth during the transition. Exits aren't just about getting from one place to another. They're about becoming who God has called you to be. Every step is an opportunity to develop your character, strengthen your faith, and deepen your dependence on God. Purposeful walking transforms the exit from just a change in location to a transformation of who you are. There's also a responsibility that comes with exiting boldly and walking purposefully. Others are watching your journey, whether you realize it or not. Your boldness can inspire someone else to trust God for their own exit. Your purposeful walk can show others what it looks like to move in faith and obedience. Like Joshua leading the Israelites into the promised land, your steps can pave the way for others to follow into their own promises. Ultimately, exiting boldly and walking purposefully is about trust. Complete unwavering trust in God's plan. It's about believing that He wouldn't call you to leave something unless He had something better ahead. It's about moving forward with confidence even when you don't have all the answers, because you trust the one who does. When you exit boldly and walk purposefully, you position yourself to not just leave behind what was, but to fully step into what is meant to be. So today, if God is calling you to exit, don't hesitate, don't second guess, and don't shrink back. Exit boldly, knowing that the same God who called you out has already prepared the path ahead. Walk purposefully with your eyes fixed on His promises, understanding that every step you take is a step deeper into your destiny. Exits aren't about endings, they're about alignments. They are divine shifts that pull you out of comfort and place you on the path to purpose. You weren't created to stay stuck in places God has outgrown for you. You weren't designed to camp in the wilderness when God has a promised land waiting. Remember this: bold exits lead to divine entrances. Every time you obey God's call to exit, you're not just leaving something behind, you're stepping into something greater. So go forward with courage, with faith, and with the confidence that heaven is backing your every step. Because when God says it's time to exit, it's also His way of saying, I'm ready to elevate you